The kingdom of the Night Fang Pack stretched out under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, vast and shadowed and ruled by a single unyielding law: strength was everything. And at the heart of this powerful territory, in a castle carved from obsidian stone that clawed at the clouds, lived the living embodiment of that law. His name was King Theron. To his pack he was not just a leader, he was a force of nature, a figure carved from ice and granite, his voice a low rumble that commanded instant silence, his eyes the sharp, cold gray of a winter storm. He moved through the grand, echoing halls of his fortress with a stillness that was more threatening than any noise, his broad shoulders seeming to carry the weight of the entire world without a single complaint. He was the perfect Alpha King. And he was, by his own firm declaration, completely and utterly alone by choice. On this particular evening, a meeting of great importance was concluding in the Grand Hall. Other alphas from neighboring packs, large men with confident stances and loud voices, had come to discuss borders and treaties. Theron sat upon his throne of dark, polished wood and wolf bone, listening to them argue and boast. His second in command, a loyal and worried warrior named Marcus, stood at his side. A strong alliance could be sealed with a mating, one of the visiting alphas suggested, a hopeful glint in his eye. My daughter is of age. She is a fierce beta, strong and... Strength is not found in a mate, Theron interrupted, his voice cutting through the chatter like a shard of ice. The room fell silent. It is found within. Love is a distraction. Attachment is a crack in the armor. A king does not rule with his heart, he rules with his will. He protects his pack with power, not with sentiment. His words were final, leaving no room for argument. This was the truth he had built his entire life upon. After the alphas departed, Marcus turned to him, a frown creasing his brow. The royal moon ceremony is in 3 nights' time, Your Highness. The pack expects you to at least try to choose a Luna. Theron waved a dismissive hand. A pageant for the hopeful. It changes nothing. My duty is to rule, not to romance. Meanwhile, so far from the stone castle it felt like a different world altogether, was the very edge of the Night Fang territory. Here, the trees grew thick and wild, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. And here, in a tiny crumbling cottage that seemed to lean against an old oak tree for support, lived a girl the pack had forgotten. Her name was Sylvia. She was an Omega, the lowest rank in the pack order, so quiet and unnoticed that most had long since stopped saying her name. Her wolf was small and a peculiar silver color, nothing like the powerful dark-furred wolves of the warriors. She was seen as weak, insignificant, a ghost on the edges of pack life. But Sylvia's world was not small. Her cottage was a haven for every injured creature of the forest. A bird with a broken wing rested in a basket by the fireplace. A fox kit, orphaned and alone, slept curled on a soft rag in the corner. Sylvia moved between them with a gentle grace, her hands skilled and sure as she ground healing herbs into pastes and prepared soothing teas. She hummed a soft, tuneless melody as she worked, her kind eyes missing nothing. She was poor in the ways of the pack. She had no fine clothes, no status, no power, but her life was rich in a quiet, steadfast kindness that the castle on the hill had long since forgotten. Back at the castle, the weight of his own words began to feel heavy even for Theron. The silence of the great stone halls felt less like peace and more like emptiness. A restless energy prickled under his skin, an agitation that only one thing could soothe. Under the cover of the rising moon, he strode out into the night, the air shimmering around him as he shifted form. Where the formidable king had stood was now an enormous wolf, his fur a deep, absolute black that swallowed the moonlight, his eyes still that same piercing, stormy gray. This was his true form, a creature of immense power and primal instinct. He ran, his powerful muscles driving him deep into the forest, trying to outrun the strange, hollow feeling in his chest. The scent of an intruder, a rogue wolf, hit his nostrils, a bitter, unclean smell that violated his territory. A snarl ripped from his throat. The chase was swift and brutal. The rogue was no match for the Alpha King. Theron drove the trespasser out with a fierce display of power, but in the final lunge through a thicket, a searing, white-hot pain shot through his hind leg. He had slammed into a patch of wolfsbane, a rare plant whose thorny vines were coated in a dusting of silver pollen. Silver. The one weakness of their kind. The poison burned through his veins like fire, and the immense strength that had fueled his run evaporated instantly. His mighty wolf form began to flicker, unable to hold itself together against the silver's toxic spread. He managed to drag himself a little further away from the fight before his body gave out. The world swam then went dark. The great black wolf collapsed, unconscious and bleeding, his breathing shallow. The moon was high when Sylvia, unable to sleep, decided to check on a rabbit she'd set in a snare earlier. She didn't like trapping, but winter was coming and she needed the fur. Wrapping a thin shawl around her shoulders, she stepped out into the clearing. That's when she saw him. A large, dark shape lying motionless near the edge of the trees. Her first thought was for one of the pack's warriors, perhaps injured on patrol. Her heart, always too soft for its own good, leaped into her throat. She hurried over, her small feet making no sound on the forest floor. Up close, she could see the terrible wound on his leg, the skin around it already an angry, inflamed red, the telltale shimmer of silver dust clinging to the fur. This was bad. This was very bad. She didn't stop to wonder who he was or how he'd gotten there. She simply acted. With a strength that surprised even her, she managed to half-drag, half-carry the heavy man into her small cottage, leaving a trail of disturbed leaves behind. She got him onto her own narrow bed, her hands moving quickly. She fetched water and clean cloths, her brow furrowed in concentration. She began to clean the wound, her touch feather-light and careful. She worked a paste of crushed yarrow and comfrey roots into the cut to draw out the poison and soothe the burn. All the while, she talked to him in a low, calming murmur, a habit she had with all her injured creatures. "Shoo, it's all right now. You're safe. Just rest. The worst is over." Theron swam back toward consciousness through a thick, painful fog. The searing agony in his leg was the first thing he knew. The second was a voice. It was soft, melodic, a gentle sound that lapped against the pain like cool water. Then he felt a touch. It was on his forehead, smoothing back his hair, and it was the most astonishing sensation. It was not the touch of a servant, fearful and quick. It was not the touch of a warrior, rough and practical. It was kind. It was caring. It was a touch that held no fear of him, only a desire to comfort. He forced his eyes open, just a slit. The world was blurry, but he could make out a face leaning over him. A girl's face, pale in the dim candlelight of the room, with eyes the color of warm earth, filled with concern. He felt a strange, impossible sense of peace, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth and everything to do with the girl's hand on his skin. The thought, hazy and disjointed, floated through his mind, safe. Then the darkness, softer this time, pulled him under once more. The first thing King Theron was aware of was the smell. It was not the scent of his own chambers, no crisp linen, no polished stone, no faint aroma of ink and parchment from his desk. This was a symphony of simpler things. The earthy fragrance of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the clean smell of wood smoke from a banked fire, the faint, sweet scent of some kind of honeyed tea. And underneath it all, something else, something light and floral that he could not name but found inexplicably calming. The second thing he was aware of was the pain, a dull, throbbing ache in his leg, a persistent echo of the silver's burn, but it was muted, distant, as if someone had built a wall between him and the worst of it. He opened his eyes, the action feeling heavy and slow. The ceiling above him was not the familiar carved stone of his canopy bed, but rough-hewn wooden beams, darkened with age and smoke. He was lying in a narrow bed, the mattress stuffed with straw that rustled faintly with his every movement. A patchwork quilt, worn soft with years of use, was pulled up to his chest. Confusion, sharp and immediate, cut through the last remnants of the fog in his mind. Where was he? This was not his castle. This was a hovel. His body tensed, the instinct of a warrior and a king kicking in. He tried to sit up, a low groan escaping his lips as the movement sent a fresh spike of pain through his leg. That's when he saw her. She was across the small room, standing at a simple wooden table, grinding something in a stone bowl with a pestle. Her back was to him, her focus entirely on her task. She was small, her frame slight, dressed in a simple, faded dress. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was tied back in a loose braid. This was the girl from his hazy memory. The one with the gentle voice and the calming touch. The one who did not seem to know who he was. "You're awake." Her voice was just as he remembered it, a soft melody that seemed to soften the edges of the rough little room. She turned, wiping her hands on a cloth. Her eyes, that warm, earthy brown, held a look of cautious relief. "You must try not to move. The silver poison was very deep. It will take time to heal." Theron's brow furrowed. He was the Alpha King. He did not take orders, he gave them. He was not accustomed to being told what he must and must not do, especially not by a stranger in a place like this. He looked down at his leg, seeing the neat bandage wrapped around his calf. The wound beneath it felt clean, the fire replaced by a cool, soothing sensation. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse, the kingly tone creeping back in despite his confusion. I cleaned it and used a poultice to draw out the silver's sickness, she explained simply, as if tending to grievously wounded werewolves was an everyday occurrence. She picked up a clay cup from the table and brought it over to him. Here, drink this. It will help with the pain and the fever. He took the cup warily, his fingers brushing against hers. A jolt, subtle but undeniable, passed between them at the contact. It was not an electric shock but something warmer, a sudden and profound sense of rightness. It was so startling that he almost dropped the cup. He saw her eyes widen just a fraction, a faint blush coloring her cheeks, and he knew she had felt it too. She quickly pulled her hand away, turning back to her table to busy herself. Theron stared at the cup in his hands, then down the contents. The tea was bitter, followed by a sweet, herbal aftertaste. Almost immediately, the throbbing in his legs subsided further. You don't know who I am, do you? Theron said, his voice quieter now, laced with a curiosity he couldn't suppress. The girl glanced back at him. Should I? Are you one of the border guards? I don't often go to the village. There was no deception in her eyes, only a simple, honest question. She truly had no idea she was addressing her king. The concept was so foreign to him, so utterly disarming, that he found he could not bring himself to shatter her ignorance. In this small, quiet space he was not a king. He was just a man. A wounded man in her care. My name is Theron, he said, offering the truth of his name if not his title. It felt strangely liberating. I am Sylvia, she replied with a small, shy smile that did something peculiar to his chest. And so, the Alpha King began a day unlike any other in his long rule-bound life. He was forced to remain in the small bed, his powerful body rendered helpless by a tiny cut and the kindness of a stranger. Sylvia moved around her cottage with a quiet efficiency, tending to her animals, preparing a simple broth for him, and changing his bandage with a clinical yet gentle touch that never failed to send that same warm jolt through him. They talked. Or rather, he found himself listening, truly listening as she spoke of the forest, of the healing properties of different plants, of the patterns of the birds and the foxes. She spoke with a wisdom that had nothing to do with books and politics and everything to do with quiet observation and a deep, innate understanding of the world around her. Theron, in turn, found himself speaking of things he never discussed. Not the burdens of kingship, but his thoughts on the changing seasons, his respect for the raw power of a thunderstorm, the simple pleasure of a quiet moment. He spoke and she listened with that same deep attention she gave everything. She was not impressed by his strength, she was interested in his mind. She was not fearful of his presence, she was concerned for his well-being. His wolf, that restless, often angry part of his soul that constantly pushed for dominance and control, was silent. For the first time in memory it was perfectly, utterly calm, soothed by her proximity, content to simply be. It was during one of these quiet conversations, as the afternoon light slanted through the single small window, that Marcus finally found them. The door to the cottage pushed open and there stood the head guard, his face a mask of sheer relief and utter bewilderment. My king. We have been searching the entire forest. We found signs of a fight and a trail of blood. His words cut off abruptly as he took in the scene before him. The mighty Alpha King, propped up in a peasant's bed, a patchwork quilt over his legs, being handed a cup of tea by a young Omega girl who looked more curious than afraid. Theron felt a familiar mask of formality snap back into place, the king returning to shield the man he had been for a few precious hours. Marcus. I am recovering. His voice was once again the voice of command, but it felt hollow now like an ill-fitting coat. Sylvia's eyes had gone wide. She looked from Marcus in his fine guard's uniform to Theron, and the pieces clearly clicked into place in her mind. The authority in his voice, the way Marcus addressed him, the sheer power he radiated even while injured. Her shy smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned realization. King, she whispered, the word barely audible. Theron saw the change in her immediately. A slight distance entered her eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. It pained him in a way he couldn't explain. He stood, testing his weight on his injured leg. The pain was a dull ache, manageable. He had to return to his world. The thought filled him with a reluctance that was entirely new. He could not stay here playing at being a simple man. He was the king. I must return to my duties, he said, his tone formal, addressing her as he would any subject who had rendered him a service. He reached for the pouch of gold coins he always carried at his belt. You have my gratitude for your assistance. Please accept this. He held out the heavy, clinking bag towards her. The reaction was not what he expected. Sylvia looked at the bag of gold as if it were a snake. The warmth in her eyes cooled, replaced by a flicker of something that looked like hurt. She took a small step back, shaking her head. "I do not want your gold, your highness," she said, her voice soft but firm, laced with a dignity that belied her simple surroundings. "I helped because you were hurt. It was the right thing to do." Her refusal stunned him. No one refused the king. No one valued simple kindness over the wealth and favor he could bestow. It was a concept so alien to his existence that he was left speechless, his hand still extended, the gold feeling suddenly heavy and worthless. He was the one who provided, who rewarded, who bestowed favor. She had turned the entire dynamic on its head. She had given him something he could not repay, and it left him feeling unbalanced, exposed. He had to leave. The silence in the small cottage was becoming unbearable, thick with things unsaid. Marcus held the door open, waiting. Theron gave a short, stiff nod and moved to walk past her, back to his life, back to his castle, back to his cold, empty throne. But as he reached the doorway, something made him stop. A force he could not name, a pull stronger than any sense of duty or decorum, made him turn back. Sylvia was still standing there, watching him go, her arms wrapped slightly around herself. Theron reached out, his movements slow and deliberate. He gently cupped her chin, tilting her face up so her eyes met his. Her skin was soft under his calloused fingers, and the contact sent that now familiar warmth spreading through him again, so intense it was almost painful. Her breath hitched, her brown eyes wide and searching his. The words that came out of his mouth were not the words of the Alpha King. They were lower, softer, filled with a sincerity that surprised even him. "Thank you, Sylvia," he said, his thumb stroking her cheek once, gently. "I will not forget your kindness." For a long, suspended moment, they simply looked at each other, the king and the forgotten Omega, in a world that had shrunk to the space between them. The air crackled with an unspoken promise, a connection that had been forged in silence and kindness and could not be severed by titles or gold. Then the moment broke. Theron dropped his hand, turned, and walked out of the cottage, leaving the echo of his touch and his words hanging in the quiet air behind him. The journey back to the obsidian castle was made in a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence in the forest. King Theron, his leg protesting with every step, walked ahead, his broad back rigid, his gaze fixed on the path before him. Marcus followed a few paces behind, his own thoughts a turbulent whirlwind of confusion and concern. He had seen the look on his king's face in that humble cottage, a look he had not witnessed in all their years together. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something far deeper, something shaken and raw. The air around Theron crackled not with his usual impatience or cold authority, but with a preoccupied energy, as if a part of him had been left behind in that small, herb-scented room. He did not speak a word, and Marcus, wisely, knew better than to break the silence. When the towering spires of the castle finally came into view, piercing the twilight sky, it should have felt like a homecoming. It was his fortress, his seat of power, the very embodiment of his life's work. But as Theron crossed the grand drawbridge and the immense gates groaned shut behind him, the feeling that settled over him was not of comfort, but of confinement. The stone walls, which had always represented strength and security, now felt like a cage. The high vaulted ceiling seemed to echo with a hollow emptiness. The servants who bowed deeply as he passed were just faceless subjects, their gestures of respect feeling automatic and meaningless compared to the genuine, unasked-for care he had just received. He retreated to his private chambers, dismissing everyone with a curt wave of his hand. Alone, the memory of Sylvia's face, the feel of her skin under his fingers, the quiet dignity in her voice when she refused his gold, played over and over in his mind like a haunting melody. His wolf, which had been so calm and content in her presence, was now a restless, agitated storm inside him, pushing against his ribs, howling a silent protest at being dragged away from her. The next 2 days were a torment. Theron threw himself into his work, reading reports, hearing petitions, training with his guards, anything to burn away the constant, nagging thought of her. But it was useless. During a council meeting about grain storage, he found himself wondering if Sylvia had enough food for the winter. While inspecting new swords forged for the warriors, he thought about her delicate hands grinding herbs. His cold, ordered world had been irrevocably cracked open, and a warmth he didn't know how to handle was spilling in, unsettling everything. The royal moon ceremony, the event he had so openly scorned, loomed ahead like a grim sentence. The great hall was prepared with garlands of night-blooming flowers and silken banners. The air grew thick with anticipation and the competing perfumes of the she-wolves who had arrived from across the territory, all hoping, preening, dreaming of becoming Luna. The night of the ceremony arrived. Theron stood before a polished silver mirror as his attendants fastened his formal cloak, a heavy garment of black velvet trimmed with wolf fur. He looked every inch the Alpha King, powerful, untouchable, severe. But the eyes that stared back at him from the reflection were not the cold, stormy gray he knew. They were troubled, searching. Marcus entered the room, his expression grim. "It is time, Your Highness," he said quietly. "The pack is assembled." Theron gave a single, sharp nod, the mask of the king settling firmly into place once more. He strode from the room, his footsteps echoing with finality through the stone corridors. The sight that greeted him in the grand hall was precisely what he had always expected it to be. A long line of she-wolves, the strongest and most beautiful the pack had to offer, stretched before his throne. They were betas and high-ranking gammas, their backs straight, their chins held high, their eyes gleaming with ambition and desire. They were perfect. They were everything a king should want. As he walked slowly down the line, each one met his gaze, some boldly, some shyly, all hoping for a spark, a sign that he had chosen them. He looked at them, these paragons of werewolf strength and beauty, and he felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. Their perfect features only seemed to highlight the memory of Sylvia's honest, gentle face. Their ambitious eyes only made him yearn for her gaze, which had seen the man, not the crown. A deep, growing emptiness opened up inside him, a void that none of these impressive she-wolves could ever hope to fill. They wanted the king. They wanted his power, his title, his throne. They did not want Theron. He reached the end of the line and turned to face the entire assembled pack. Hundreds of faces looked back at him, eager, waiting for his decision. The silence was immense, heavy with expectation. He looked out at them, his people, and he knew with a certainty that shook him to his very core that he could not go through with this. He could not choose a Luna from this line. It would be the greatest lie he had ever told. He took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice, usually so firm and commanding, was different. It was quieter, but it carried through the hall with a new, profound power, the power of raw, undeniable truth. "I have listened to the traditions of our pack," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I have stood before you all and spoken of strength being the only thing that matters. I have believed that a king must rule with a heart of stone." He paused, and the hall was so silent one could hear the flicker of the torch flames. "But I was wrong." A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. "I have been shown that there is a strength far greater than physical power. It is the strength of a kind heart. It is the courage to help a stranger without any thought of reward. It is a dignity that exists not in a title but in one's character." He looked away from the crowd, towards the great doors of the hall, towards the forest beyond. "They said the Alpha King could never love. They said I could only rule. But they were mistaken." His voice grew stronger, filled with a conviction that electrified the air. "My heart has already found its match. It has found its Luna. And she is not standing in this line." Before the gasps and the murmurs of shock could fully erupt, Theron was moving. He walked away from the throne, away from the stunned silence of his pack, away from the life he had always known. He moved with a single-minded purpose, his long strides eating up the distance between the castle and the forest edge. He did not shift into his wolf form. This was something he needed to do as a man. He pushed through the undergrowth, his royal cloak catching on brambles, his heart hammering against his ribs not with exertion, but with a desperate, hopeful fear. What if she sent him away? What if he had ruined everything with his offer of gold? What if the connection he felt had been only in his mind? He burst into the clearing where her cottage stood, the moon painting the small building in a soft, silver light. And there she was. Sylvia was on her knees in her garden, her hands buried in the soil, tending to a late-blooming plant. She looked up at the sound of his approach, her eyes widening in surprise. She slowly rose to her feet, wiping her earthy hands on her apron, her expression unreadable. Theron stopped a few feet from her, his breath coming in short clouds in the cool night air. All his kingly eloquence, all his practiced speeches deserted him. He was just a man standing before a woman, his heart in his hands. "Sylvia," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "I left the royal moon ceremony. I left them all standing there." She simply watched him, waiting, her beautiful face calm but her eyes filled with a storm of emotion. "They were perfect. They were everything a king is supposed to want," he continued, taking a step closer, his voice low and intense. "But they weren't you." He saw her breath catch. "You were right to refuse the gold. What you gave me was priceless. You saw me. Not the king. Not the alpha. Just me. You showed me kindness without wanting anything back. You showed me that my heart wasn't made of stone after all. He closed the final distance between them, his gaze locked on hers, pouring every ounce of his feeling into his words. They said I could never love. But you, Sylvia, you proved them all wrong. You found the heart I thought I had lost forever. He reached out, not to cup her chin as he had before, but to take both of her hands in his, lacing their fingers together. Her hands were warm and slightly rough from her work, and holding them felt more right than any crown ever had. I am not here as your king. I am here as Theron. A man who has fallen, completely and irreversibly, in love with you. Will you stay by my side? Will you be my Luna? Not because I command it, but because you choose it? Because you choose me? Tears welled in Sylvia's eyes, but they were tears of joy, sparkling in the moonlight. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face, and the most radiant, breathtaking smile spread across her features, lighting up the entire night. There is no choice to make, Theron, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. My heart has been yours since the moment you looked at me in that cottage. Yes. 1,000 times yes. And as he leaned down and finally kissed her, it was not a claiming kiss, nor a kiss of passion alone. It was a promise. It was a vow. It was sweet and deep and full of a love that had been waiting for both of them all along. It was the kiss that sealed their destiny, the proof that love was the greatest power of all. King Theron did not return to the castle alone that night. He returned with his queen. And together they ruled the Night Fang Pack not with cold power, but with a united strength built on kindness, respect, and a love that had once been thought impossible. Sylvia taught him to see the strength in compassion, and he protected the gentle heart that had saved his own. They proved everyone wrong, and in doing so, they found a happiness more profound than any crown could ever offer. And if you want to join us for more stories of love that conquers all, of unexpected heroes and heartwarming endings, make sure to subscribe to the channel. A new adventure is always just around the corner.